Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for African News with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, jihadists in Mali declare that France is the enemy after announcing the death of a hostage held since 2012. France says it thinks Gilberto Rodriguez-Leal may have died several weeks ago. Also in South Sudan, UN peacekeepers battle to protect civilians at its base in Bentiu. Hundreds were the victims of an ethnic massacre there last week. Rebels deny responsibility. And over 1,000 Muslims stuck in one of the most notoriously violent hotspots in Bangui hope to be relocated. Religious divisions continue to drive revenge attacks in PK12 and elsewhere in the country. First up, one of Mali's most notorious jihadist groups has announced the death of a French hostage, declaring that he was killed because France is the enemy. 62-year-old Gilberto Rodriguez-Leal was kidnapped in November 2012 near the western town of Kayes as he was driving from Mauritania. France believes he may have died several weeks ago. While France 24's Alex Duval-Smith is in Bamako, she brings us more.
I think what's interesting to do, though, is to look back on recent hostage cases. Last year we had the death of Philippe Verdon, who was taken hostage on the 24th of November 2011, and it was similar. There was a lot of speculation about when he died and whether he died of natural causes or whether he had been killed. He was found with a bullet in his head eventually, and that news was confirmed. But these are people who are of a certain age. Rodriguez-Leal was 62 years old, and Philippe Verdon was known not to be in very good health. So we don't actually know whether, as these groups happily claim and quickly claim, they have been, they've been killed, or whether the hostages are in declining health. I mean, as I speak to you now, it's 42 degrees in Bamako, and anybody with the slightest weak health is going to succumb eventually when they're kept in difficult conditions.
Now, France is continuing to wind down its troop presence in Mali, but this clearly shows just how very much the jihadist threat remains a danger.
Very much so, and I think Mali's fallen out of the news somewhat. There's been a French drawdown. A lot of the focus of French military action now is on the Central African Republic. France still has over 1,000 troops here. They're said to have changed to an anti-terror regional brief as opposed to being much more hands-on in terms of Mali, but they're still on the ground here. In fact, French troops were involved only last week in the release of 5 Malian hostages. So they're here, but they're not in the same active role as they were before.
Well, Rodriguez-Leal's reported death comes against the backdrop of tension in northern Mali, where Islamist militia, including Mujao, are reportedly regrouping after having been routed in an offensive by French forces last year.
The Movement for Oneness and Jihad in West Africa, Mujao, was created in 2011. Its founder is Hamada Ould Mohamed Keiru from Mauritania. He felt that the head of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Abdelmalek Droukdel, only gave senior positions to Algerians. Keiru's aim is to promote the Salafist ideology among the non-Arabic people in the region. In April 2012, the Mujao kidnapped 7 Algerian diplomats in Gao. One of them was killed a few months later. In June 2012, the group seized the whole of Gao, northern Mali's biggest town. They used corporal punishment against those who refused Sharia law. Mujao fled Gao in January 2013 after the arrival of troops from France and Niger. But since then, its members, who are also drug traffickers, have continued to carry out sporadic attacks in the region. They are the ones who kidnapped Frenchman Gilberto Rodriguez-Leal and later a team from the ICRC, which was released last week. Mujao is also close to Boko Haram, the jihadist group that operates in northern Nigeria.
South Sudanese peace talks have been delayed again as UN peacekeepers battle to protect over 20,000 civilians taking refuge at a besieged base in Bentiu. That's where aid workers say hundreds were slaughtered in an ethnic massacre. Bodies still line the streets, but rebels deny responsibility for the killings. More than 1 million people have fled since fighting began between troops backing President Salva Kiir and those loyal to his former number 2, Riek Machar. The UN says that the killings in Bentiu followed hate speech broadcast on local radio.
I think it's been a particularly troubling week for Bentiu and in particular the population there. But what we really saw was the aftermath of the fighting. The city had changed hands, and we understand that there were hate messages that were propagated via a local FM radio station. And in that sense, this is the first time that we have seen the use of the media to incite violence. I think that is a game changer in the case of South Sudan. Atrocities followed thereafter, where there was a very deliberate and direct targeting of certain ethnic groups, not just one, by the way, as well as traders who had come across the border from Sudan, Darfuri traders, whose sole purpose in the town was to help get the market back up and running after previous weeks of violence. So this is a further illustration of the terrible spiral which South Sudan is currently plunged into, where things are getting worse and worse, and we've now got perhaps as many as 7 million people at risk of hunger.
Muslims continue to be relocated from hotspots in Central African Republic's capital. They've been targeted by Christian militia, and antagonism between the communities remains a problem even at displacement sites like that in Boda.
Captain Jeremy is surrounded by his men. Most like him work in the diamond mines. They have all become members of the anti-Bellica Christian militia. Their mission is to fight the Seleka rebels from the north. Captain Jeremy's men now control the Maoro sector in the town of Boda. The men brandish their knives and machetes. They're threatening the 10,000 to 14,000 besieged Muslims trapped in the town. They're demanding that they leave. A lot of blood has already been shed here.
It's the Seleka. They took total control. They're responsible for bringing war to Boda. These Muslims distributed weapons to their brothers here, and they turned them against the Christians.
The ousting of the Seleka rebels last January sparked a wave of reprisals and counter-reprisals by Christians and Muslims. This is the Christian quarter of the town, or what's left of it. Residents take shelter in the parish of Saint Michel. Nearly 9,000 people have been displaced, and despite the rainy season, many, fearing for their lives, prefer to flee through the bush. The future is uncertain. The past has been turned upside down.
We used to live in harmony with the Muslims and everyone. Muslims even married our sisters and our aunts. We have cousins from other bloodlines living here with us.
Do you think you can ever live together again?
No, it's impossible. And I mean impossible with a capital I.
Drivers and passengers are too afraid to drive through the Muslim quarters. They wait to be escorted by French soldiers. The town is paralyzed by hatred. The recreation ground has become a market. Administrative offices and health centers are abandoned, and the schools are empty.
I'm here for the very young kids. They're not getting any schooling. It's very worrisome. The parents will not let their children go to school. They say that as long as the Muslims are still there, they cannot let the children go.
And on the walls of the devastated city, drawings by the children do not bode well for the future.
Well, just 100 Muslims were relocated from the notoriously violent PK-12 area of Bongi over the weekend. They were moved to Bambari, but over 1,000 remain behind, facing daily danger from Christian militia. Chris Lom is from the International Organization for Migration, which arranged to move people out. He tells us it's difficult to settle on logistics in such an explosive context.
There is a lot of red tape, and the movement this weekend of 100 Muslims from PK-12 was a very, very complex and very expensive operation. And it was involved not only the UN, but also the government, the French military, the various UN agencies who had to be set up to meet the people arriving in Bambari. And the sheer complexity and expense of it and the protection issues associated with it means that we don't know whether it can be repeated in future.
Now, even at the displacement site, we saw in that last report, for example, Boda, that there is a lot of animosity between the Christians and the Muslims who are at that place. That must affect the logistics of tackling those who are in need on either side.
It is an enormously complex and it takes an enormous amount of time to actually negotiate with the various factions, with all the stakeholders, to ensure that every community is helped and their needs are met in a way that satisfies them. Otherwise, it could actually stir up additional violence, additional hatred. And therefore, aid agencies are in a very peculiar situation by which they have to very methodically negotiate with all the stakeholders in order to distribute relatively limited amounts of aid or in order to move people relatively short distances.
Chris Slom there from the IOM speaking to me a little earlier on. Well, that wraps up African News from me for today. Stay with us, so more news and headlines from around the world coming up.